The winter sun hung low and pale over the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace, casting long, skeletal shadows across the frost-kissed lawns. Inside, the world was all polished mahogany, the scent of beeswax, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. For Sergeant Alistair Finch, this silence was the sound of a job well done. For 7 years he had been a ghost in the royal residences, a shadow in a scarlet tunic and bearskin cap, his existence predicated on being seen but never noticed, present but never acknowledged. His domain was the royal nursery wing, and his charge was the small, vibrant hurricane that was Prince Louis. Alistair was a man carved from granite and quiet duty. At 42, his back was ramrod straight, his jaw was a hard line, and his eyes, the color of a winter sea, missed nothing. He had served in conflict zones where the air hummed with imminent danger, but he had found a different, more insidious kind of tension here. It wasn't the threat from outside that kept him vigilant. It was the unpredictable nature of his young charge. Louis, at 4 years old, was a tempest in tiny wellies, a bundle of boundless energy and burgeoning willpower contained within the gilded cage of royal protocol. The afternoon had started like any other. Alistair had taken up his post in the corridor just outside the playroom, a spacious, sun-drenched room overflowing with toys that cost more than most people's annual salary. Through the half-open door, he could hear the cheerful chaos. The nanny, a capable woman named Elspeth, was attempting to guide Louis through a puzzle of the British Isles. He could hear Louis's high, clear voice, declaring that Scotland was a dinosaur and that he was going to make it roar. A smile, slight and quickly suppressed, touched Alistair's lips. The boy was incorrigible. His duties were simple in theory, complex in practice. He was there to protect, but from what? In this environment, the greatest threat was often a fall from a climbing frame or a collision with a piece of furniture. He was a watcher, a silent guardian. He watched as Elspeth's patience began to fray. He watched as Louis's focus shifted from the puzzle to a far more interesting target, a beautiful, intricate model of Tower Bridge, a gift from a foreign dignitary that sat on a low shelf. "No, Louis, we don't touch that one," Elspeth said, her voice taking on a familiar, weary tone. "That's for looking at, not for playing." Louis, his lower lip jutting out. He looked from the bridge to Elspeth and back again. To Alistair, who understood the language of potential incidents, the look was a declaration of intent. He shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, ready to move. For a few minutes there was a tense standoff. Louis circled the table, his eyes fixed on the model. Elspeth tried to redirect him, holding up a colorful tractor book. Louis ignored her. He made a grab for the bridge, and Elspeth gently but firmly took his hand and guided him away. A wail of protest, shrill and piercing, tore through the peaceful afternoon. Louis squirmed, his face turning a splotchy red. He threw himself on the floor, a tiny royal tyrant in the throes of a tantrum. Alistair remained still. Tantrums were not in his job description. That was Elspeth's domain. She knelt beside him, speaking in low, but soothing tones. The wailing subsided into hiccuping sobs. Alistair allowed himself to relax a fraction. Crisis averted. Then, the door to the playroom opened, and the energy in the room shifted instantly. It was the Prince of Wales. He was dressed in a sharp, dark suit, his phone in his hand, his mind clearly elsewhere. He was a man perpetually in motion, even when standing still. He glanced at the scene on the floor, his sobbing son, the flustered nanny, and a flicker of impatience crossed his features. "What's all this, then?" he asked, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of command. Elspeth rose quickly. "Just a little trouble with the puzzle, sir. Louis is tired." The prince didn't look convinced. He looked at Louis. "Come on, up you get. No need for all that noise." He gestured for Elspeth to leave the room. She gave Alistair a small, worried look as she passed him in the corridor. Alistair's posture became even more rigid. The dynamic in the room had changed. The playful chaos was gone, replaced by a charged formality, even between father and son. The prince put his phone away and knelt down. "Now, Louis, what's all this about? The whole palace can hear you." Louis, sniffling, pointed a chubby finger at the Tower Bridge model. "Want that?" "That's not a toy, it's a model. It's very special. You have to be careful with special things," the prince explained, his tone reasonable but firm. "I'll be careful," Louis insisted, his voice wobbling. The prince hesitated, then made a decision. "All right, you can look at it, but just with your eyes. No touching." He lifted Louis and placed him on the floor in front of the shelf. Now Louis stood mesmerized, his face inches from the glass cases and tiny suspension cables. For a moment, all was well. The prince watched him, a softness entering his eyes. He reached out a hand to ruffle Louis's hair, but at that exact moment, Louis, his impulse control utterly overwhelmed by the object of his desire, shot out a hand to grab the bridge. What happened next was a blur. The prince's hand, aiming for a gentle pat, made contact with Louis's outstretched arm, not to hurt, but to prevent him from grabbing the delicate structure. It was a reflex, a parental block. But the force of the interception, combined with Louis's own momentum, caused the little boy to stumble sideways. He didn't fall. He caught himself on the edge of the shelf, but the shock of the sudden, forceful restraint was immense. A beat of stunned silence filled the room. Louis stood perfectly still, his back to his father. Then he turned. His face was a mask of shock, his wide blue eyes brimming with sudden hot tears, not of frustration but of bewilderment. He looked not at his father but past him, his gaze landing on the familiar, solid figure of Alistair in the doorway. And in that high, clear, trembling voice that cut through the silence like a shard of glass, Louis cried out, "He hurt me!" The words hung in the air, an atomic bomb of accusation in the hushed and gilded palace. The prince's face went pale, then flushed a deep, angry red. His own shock was evident. He hadn't hurt his son. He had stopped him. But in the court of a child's perception, there was no distinction. Alistair's world telescoped down to a single point. The last 7 years of silent, perfect service evaporated in an instant. His duty, his honor, his very existence was predicated on the safety and well-being of the child. And the child had just uttered the words that could shatter everything. This was no longer a quiet afternoon. This was an incident. This was a crisis. He was no longer a silent guardian. He was a witness, and his protocol was now terrifyingly clear. He took one step into the room, his boots making a soft, decisive sound on the polished floor. His face was an unreadable mask, but his mind was a supercomputer processing data at lightning speed. The child's safety was his primary concern. The accusation had been made. He had to act. The prince straightened up, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. And he looked from his son's tear-streaked face to the immovable figure of the guardsman. The air crackled with tension. A simple private moment of familial friction had, in the span of 3 words, become a matter of official record. Alistair didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence in the room was the statement. He moved swiftly, but without panic. He knelt beside Louis, bringing himself to the child's eye level. Louis, seeing his protector, his silent, strong shadow, reached out and grabbed a fistful of Alistair's scarlet tunic, burying his face in the rough fabric. Alistair placed a large, steady hand on the boy's small back, feeling the frantic thumping of his heart. The gesture was not one of judgment, but of reassurance. His duty was to the child. He looked up at the prince. Their eyes met. In the prince's gaze, Alistair saw a complex storm, embarrassment, anger, and a flicker of something else. Perhaps fear. Fear of the interpretation, fear of the scandal, fear of the institution that his own family represented. Alistair's eyes held only a calm, professional resolve. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The message was clear. I have heard. I have seen. I must now follow procedure. He gently disengaged Louis's grip and stood up. He walked to the antique phone on the side table. He didn't look at the prince for permission. He didn't need it. His orders came from a different place, a higher authority, the security protocol for the protection of the royal family. An accusation of physical harm, even from a child, even within the family, triggered an automatic, mandatory report. As he lifted the receiver and dialed a short internal code, but the silence in the room was absolute. He could feel the prince's gaze burning into his back, a mixture of fury and dawning horror. He could hear Louis's small, hitching breaths behind him. He spoke in a low, clear voice, giving his name, his location, and the code for an immediate supervisory alert. The words felt heavy, monumental. Within minutes, the quiet corridor was a hive of silent, urgent activity. 2 plainclothes officers from the palace's protection command arrived first, their faces serious. They spoke in hushed tones to Alistair, who stood apart, his report given with clipped professional accuracy. He stated only what he had seen and heard, the prince's arrival, the interaction, the stumble, and the child's precise words. He offered no interpretation, no opinion. Then came a senior member of the royal household, and a woman with an icy composure who looked as if she had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. She spoke briefly with the prince, who stood by the window, his back to the room, his posture rigid. The nanny, Elspeth, was brought back, her face pale with worry. Louis was gently taken from the playroom by a female protection officer he knew, his small hand clutching a stuffed dog. The playroom, once a place of joyful noise, was now a silent crime scene of domesticity. Alistair remained in the corridor, his post. He could hear muffled voices from behind closed doors. He didn't know what was being said, what explanations were being offered, or what accusations were being leveled. He only knew that his world, the quiet, ordered world he had inhabited for 7 years, had been irrevocably shattered by the cry of a child. Then later that evening, the storm broke. Alistair was summoned to a small, windowless office in the administrative wing. Across a desk sat a stern-faced man from the palace's legal team and a senior officer from the Metropolitan Police's Royalty Protection Branch. The questioning was thorough, meticulous, and calm. They went over his statement again and again. Had the prince seemed angry? Had he raised his voice? What was the exact nature of the contact? Could the child have been in any danger? Alistair answered each question with the same unwavering, factual precision. No, the prince had not seemed angry, merely firm. No, he had not raised his voice. The contact was a restraining motion that resulted in an unintended stumble. At no point did he believe the child was in danger. He was thanked and dismissed. He walked back through the silent, cavernous corridors of the palace, a man utterly alone. He passed portraits of monarchs past, their painted eyes seeming to follow him, judging him. He had done his duty. He had followed the protocol that was drilled into him from his first day. But he knew, with a cold, heavy certainty, that in a world where perception was reality and loyalty was paramount, his actions would not be seen as duty. They would be seen as a betrayal. The next morning, the world outside the palace walls woke up to a different story. The tabloids led with it, a masterpiece of insinuation and leaked information. "Royal nanny quits after he hurt me drama," screamed one headline. Another, more subtle but infinitely more damaging, whispered, "Palace playroom tension. What really happened?" There were no names, no direct accusations against the prince. It was all hinted at, a story told in winks and nudges, a cloud of suspicion carefully crafted from the single innocent cry of a child. Someone had talked. Someone had leaked the story, twisting it, shaping it to fit a narrative of a dysfunctional, unhappy family. Alistair stood in the small staff canteen, a mug of cold tea in his hand, staring at the television screen mounted on the wall. He felt a sickness deep in his gut. This was the consequence. This was the monster his report had unleashed. The carefully curated image of the monarchy had been chipped, and he was the one who had held the chisel. His phone buzzed. A text from his line manager. A meeting. Immediately. He was led not to an office, but to a quiet side gate of the palace. Waiting for him was another protection officer, and a man he knew by sight. In his hand, he held a small cardboard box. "Your personal effects from your locker, Sergeant Finch," the man said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Your security pass, please." Alistair stared at the box, then at the man. No explanation. No "we're sorry." No "thank you for your 7 years of service." Just a box and a demand. He was being removed, excised like a cancerous cell from the body of the institution. He was the witness who had spoken, and in a world built on secrets, a witness who speaks is a liability. He handed over his pass. The man nodded and walked away. Alistair was left standing on the pavement outside the palace gates, the iconic black and gold bars now a barrier between him and the life he had known. The cold wind bit through his civilian coat. Passers-by hurried past, oblivious to the man whose simple act of duty had just cost him his career and his identity. He looked back at the palace, at the window he knew belonged to the nursery wing. Somewhere up there, a small boy was starting his day, probably already having forgotten the incident that had so profoundly altered the course of a man's life. For Alistair, the silence that followed was not the comfortable, purposeful silence of duty. It was the vast, empty silence of a future that had vanished, a reputation in tatters, and a question that would haunt him for the rest of his days. In choosing to do everything by the book, had he done the one thing that was truly unforgivable? The royal guard had raised the alarm, and in doing so had sounded the death knell for his own quiet, honorable life.